A trail of blood led Elias to a wounded girl he was never meant to save. What followed tested his courage, his past, and his very place in the world. The trail began just past the creek, where Elias watered his horses, a dark stain across the pale earth, too red to be mistaken for anything but blood. He crouched low, pressing his calloused fingers to it, feeling the stickiness that told him it was fresh. His stomach tightened. Out here, miles from town, a blood trail meant trouble. He rose slowly, eyes narrowing as he followed the smeared path winding between the cottonwoods, his boots crunching on dry leaves, his rifle slung across his shoulder, though he had not yet lifted it. The land was quiet, almost too quiet, and each step carried the weight of something waiting ahead. The trail grew heavier near a bend in the trees. Dark blotches leading to a shape collapsed against the roots of a fallen trunk. For a moment Elias thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer shot and left, but as he drew closer, his chest clenched. It was not an animal, it was a girl. She lay curled on her side, her dress torn and soaked with blood from her shoulder. Her skin was copper, toned, her hair black and tangled with dirt and leaves, her breaths shallow and ragged. Even without the marks of her clothing, Elias knew Sioux. His first thought was to turn back, to walk away before anyone saw him near her. He knew the whispers in town, knew the way neighbors judged quick and cruel, and helping her could mark him as a traitor. But his boots did not move. He stood there, staring at her face twisted in pain, at her small hands clenched in the dirt. She was no older than 16, maybe younger. Elias felt his throat dry. She stirred weakly at the sound of his boots, her dark eyes flicking open, wild with fear. She tried to push herself up, but fell back with a whimper that tore at something deep in him. He cursed under his breath and knelt beside her, hands hovering above her body, unsure if she would flinch or fight. She whispered something he could not understand, her words broken and desperate, and then her eyes rolled back. Elias swallowed hard, torn between reason and something heavier than reason, something that felt like memory. He had once watched his wife fade to sickness, while men in town had shrugged and said it was God's will. He had promised himself never again to stand idle when life hung by a thread. His rough hands slid beneath her, lifting her light frame with care. She was thin as a reed, her bones pressing against his arms, her blood soaking into his shirt. She did not cry out, only groaned, her head falling against his chest as if too tired to fight. Elias rose with a grunt, his boots steady now, his decision made. He glanced once toward the horizon, half expecting riders to appear, but the land lay empty. Carrying her back across his fields, he felt the weight of more than her body. He felt the weight of danger, of whispers yet to come, of the line he had just crossed. But beneath it all, there was a spark of something else, something he hadn't felt since he buried his wife. Purpose. The girl's breath fluttered against his chest, weak but alive, and he tightened his hold as if daring the world to try to take her from his arms. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old leather, the single lantern on the table casting a soft glow that pushed the shadows back only a little. Elias laid the girl gently on his bed, the only real bed in the place, and pulled the blanket over her shivering body. Her blood had soaked through his shirt, drying in a stiff crust against his chest, and when he stepped back to look at her, he felt the knot in his throat tighten. She was so young, her face sharp with pain, her lips cracked from thirst. He had seen men die from less, and if he did nothing, she would not last the night. He set water to boil on the stove, his hands moving steady though his heart hammered like a colt's hooves against a stall. When the steam rose, he tore strips from an old shirt and soaked them, bringing the cloth back to where she lay. She flinched when he touched her shoulder, her eyes snapping open, dark and fierce, and for a moment Elias thought she might strike him. But she only stared, wide and unblinking, as if measuring whether he was threat or salvation. "I ain't here to hurt you," he murmured. though he knew she did not understand the words. Still, he spoke them for himself, for the silence pressing so heavy it threatened to choke him. Slowly, he eased the torn cloth away from her wound, cleaning the blood that clung stubborn to her skin. She winced, but did not cry out, only bit her lip and held his gaze. The gash was deep, a slice across the shoulder that looked made by steel, not claw. Elias swallowed hard, guessing at what had brought her here. A raid gone wrong, or soldiers on patrol, or maybe worse. He had no answers, only the sharp awareness that by binding her wound, he was binding himself to a danger that stretched far beyond his door. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the lonely howl of a coyote. Inside, the lantern flickered as Elias worked, his breath slow and measured. When he pressed the cloth to her shoulder, her small hand shot up, gripping his wrist. Her fingers were surprisingly strong, her nails biting into his skin. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity that froze him, as though she were demanding truth from a man she could not understand. He let her hold on, let her see there was no cruelty in him, only the stubborn need to keep her breathing. At last, she released him, her hand falling back weakly, her lashes lowering as if the fight had drained out of her. Elias tied the cloth firm and pulled the blanket higher, tucking it around her with the same care he had once shown his wife when fever burned through her body. The memory twisted in him like a blade. He had failed then, helpless as she faded day by day, his hands useless against God's will. But here, now, with this girl who the world would call enemy, he felt a chance to do what he could not before. He sat back, wiping sweat from his brow, and watched the rise and fall of her chest beneath the wool. She was alive, for now. He knew the talk it would stir if anyone learned she was under his roof. Men in town already distrusted him for keeping to himself, for not joining their councils or hunts, and this would be enough to see him driven out or worse, but he could not leave her to die. That was the truth, as solid as the floor beneath his boots. As the lantern hissed low, Elias leaned his rifle against the door and sat in the chair across from the bed, his eyes never leaving her. Her breaths came uneven, but she slept. The silence in the cabin was heavy, yet for the first time in years, Elias did not feel alone. The next morning the girl still breathed, her skin less pale, her fever cooled by the wet cloth Elias had laid across her brow through the long hours of the night. He left her with the fire stoked and water within reach, whispering a promise she would never understand, and saddled his horse for town. Supplies were low, and he needed more bandages and clean cloth if he was to keep her alive. The ride felt longer than usual, every hoofbeat echoing with the weight of what he carried in his cabin. The general store was quiet when he pushed open the door, the bell overhead giving a faint ring. Mr. Hanley, the storekeeper, nodded a greeting, his eyes lingering just long enough to stir Elias's unease. Two other men stood near the shelves, picking through nails and tools, their voices lowered but sharp enough to carry. Elias caught the word Sioux and stilled, his hand tightening on the list folded in his pocket. He moved toward the counter, keeping his hat low, hoping to finish quick and ride back before anyone looked too close. But the voices grew clearer. One man muttered about a ranch burned down west of the river, cattle stolen, a boy missing. Another spat, saying raiding parties were moving closer, bolder than before. Elias could feel the shift in the air, the way suspicion spread like fire in dry grass. Someone swore the army would be called soon, and another said what needed doing was men riding out themselves to drive the savages back. Their words dripped with anger, sharpened by fear, and Elias felt his stomach twist. When he laid his list on the counter, Hanley gave a half smile, the kind that wasn't friendly. "Haven't seen you in town much, Elias," he said slowly. "Some folks been wondering what keeps you out there all alone." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, like a knife testing a hide. Elias kept his face steady, and muttered something about work and fences needing mending. He could hear the men behind him fall silent, the weight of their stares pressing between his shoulder blades. Hanley filled the order, his hands moving steady, but his mouth didn't stay shut. He asked if Elias had heard about the Sioux sign found near the ridge, bloody tracks in the dirt. Maybe someone wounded carried off into the hills. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, but he kept his eyes on the counter, nodding without a word. His silence was answer enough, and it only made the storekeeper lean in closer. If a man was fool enough to shelter one of them, well, folks would call it treason, Hanley said softly. No law needed. Justice would come quicker than a judge. Elias paid in silence, every coin clinking like a nail hammered into his coffin. He gathered the supplies, tipped his hat, and walked out slow, though his pulse throbbed fast and heavy. Outside, the sun felt harsh, the dust swirling around his boots like a warning. He mounted his horse and rode hard, leaving the whispers behind, but they followed him anyway, echoing in his ears, curling like smoke inside his chest. He had always been a man apart, content with distance, but now he knew the town's eyes would be sharper, their patience thin. By the time his cabin came into view, Elias felt the noose of suspicion already tightening around his neck. Inside, the girl lay sleeping, her face peaceful under the quilt. For a moment he stood at the doorway, staring at her, knowing she was the reason men would spit his name in disgust. Yet when she stirred and opened her eyes, dark and watchful, Elias understood the choice was already made. He would rather bear the weight of whispers than let her life slip away. The night settled heavy over the prairie, the stars sharp and cold above the cabin roof. But inside the walls, the air was thick with heat and fear. The girl tossed under the blanket, her skin burning, sweat slicking her brow and soaking the bandages at her shoulder. Elias sat close, the lantern light trembling across his tired face, and dipped another strip of cloth into the bowl of cool water. He wrung it out with rough hands and laid it gently across her forehead, watching her lips move with words he could not understand. The sounds were soft and broken, her voice caught between prayer and dream, and though he did not know their meaning, he felt the weight of them as surely as if they had been his own. Every so often she would jolt, a sharp cry slipping from her throat, and Elias would hold her still until the shudder passed. His heart ached in the silence between those moments, for the memory of another bed, another fever, another face pale with sickness. He saw his wife as she had been in her last days, her hand limp in his, her eyes dull with fever, and he remembered the helplessness that had hollowed him. He had begged then, pleaded with God and man, but the illness had swallowed her all the same. Now, as he looked at the girl before him, he felt the same helplessness claw at him, but he clenched his jaw and pushed it back. He would not let death take her without a fight. The hours stretched long. He fed the stove, checked the fire, replaced the cloth, and whispered words, though he knew she could not understand. "Hold on, girl. Just hold on. You're stronger than this." He spoke not for her ears, but for his own, to keep the quiet from sinking its teeth too deep. Her face shifted with each turn of the fever, sometimes tight with pain, sometimes slack with exhaustion, but every breath she drew gave him another spark of resolve. Near midnight he tried to lift her to sip water, holding the cup steady against her lips. She coughed weakly, spilling most of it down her chin, yet a few drops passed her throat, and Elias counted that as a victory. He wiped her clean with a gentle hand, his fingers shaking as they brushed against her skin. He had never thought himself a tender man, not after years of hard work and solitude. But in that moment, he handled her as though she were porcelain, fragile and precious. The fever raged on, hours grinding by with no sign of breaking. Elias's eyes burned with exhaustion, yet he did not leave her side. He dozed only in snatches, jerking awake each time her voice rose in a dream. The words she spoke meant nothing to his ears, but the tone cut deep, heavy with fear, heavy with longing. He wished he could tell her she was safe, that the cabin walls would hold, that he would not let harm reach her, but all he could do was hold the cloth to her brow and wait. Toward dawn, the heat in her skin eased a little. Not gone, but dulled, and her breathing smoothed into a softer rhythm. Elias leaned back in the chair, his shoulders slumping, the ache in his bones sharp and merciless. He stared at her sleeping face, pale beneath the lantern's glow, and let out a long breath he had not known he was holding. He knew this fight was not finished, knew the fever might rise again, but for that moment she had survived the night. He set the damp cloth back across her brow and whispered into the quiet, a vow spoken low but steady, that he would not fail this time. The first light of dawn spilled across the plains, soft and pale, brushing the tops of the grass with gold. Elias stood on the porch with his rifle resting against the post, the cool air filling his lungs, his eyes heavy from the long night beside the fevered girl. The silence of morning was steady, the kind that usually meant another day of work and solitude, but this time something was wrong. The quiet did not bring peace, it brought a tightening in his chest. He felt it before he saw it, that shift in the air that told him he was no longer alone. Then he saw them. 10 riders appeared on the ridge, their shapes black against the rising sun. They rode in a line, their horses strong and sure, the sun behind them making them look like spirits cut from fire and shadow. As they crested the ridge, Elias counted their number and knew at once who they were. Sioux warriors, armed with bows and rifles, their faces hard and unreadable from where he stood. His stomach sank, for he understood what trail they followed. The blood that had led him to the girl now led them to him. He did not move at first. The rifle leaned within reach, his horse tied at the side of the cabin, but he knew neither would save him if they came to kill. He had seen enough of men to know when they rode with purpose, and these rode as if driven by something more than chance. Dust curled around their horses' hooves, the thunder of their approach shaking the stillness of the morning. Elias's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking once to the window where the girl lay inside. She had stirred weakly in the night, whispering words he could not understand, but she still lived. Now her people had come, and he did not know if they would thank him for her life or end his for touching her. The riders slowed as they neared the cabin, spreading out in a half circle, their eyes locked on him. Elias felt the weight of their gaze, sharp and cold, as though they could see through his skin to the truth of what he had done. He stood tall, his hands loose at his sides, though his heart hammered hard enough to shake him. He wanted to call out, to explain in words they might not understand, that he had not harmed her, that he had given her water and warmth, that he had kept her alive through the night. But his tongue felt thick, useless, and he knew words would not carry as far as trust. One of the warriors, taller than the rest, urged his horse a step forward. The man's face was lined with scars, his eyes hard as stone, his rifle slung across his back. He raised his hand, pointing at the cabin door, then back at Elias, his meaning clear, without language. They wanted her. The blood trail had ended here, and they had come to take back what was theirs, no matter the cost. Elias felt the moment press down on him, heavy and final. He could have lifted the rifle, could have made his stand then and there, but something deeper than fear rooted him to the porch. He did not raise his weapon. Instead, he stood steady, his voice low, and even as he whispered to the rising sun, not to them but to himself, "God help me." Inside the cabin, the girl coughed weakly, the sound cutting through the stillness. Every warrior's head turned toward the sound, their eyes narrowing. Elias drew in a slow breath, his choice clear now. The blood trail had led them to his door, and whatever came next would decide not only her fate, but his own. The riders fanned out in the pale light, their horses stamping at the dirt, the sound of hooves heavy against the morning stillness. Elias stood on the porch with his rifle loose in his grip, the barrel pointed to the ground, not raised, not threatening. His breath came slow but steady, though his heart pounded in his chest like a hammer against iron. He watched as the warriors closed in, their circle tightening around the cabin, their faces stern and unreadable. Smoke from their last campfire clung to their hair and clothes, and the smell of horse sweat hung sharp in the cool air. From inside the cabin came a sound that cut through the tension like a knife, the girl's weak voice calling out, broken but clear enough to draw every pair of eyes toward the door. Elias shifted slightly, his shoulders stiffening as one of the warriors urged his horse forward, shouting sharp words he could not understand. The man pointed at the cabin with a quick jerk of his hand, his tone harsh, and though Elias did not know the language, he knew what it meant. They wanted her. The rifle in Elias's hands felt heavy, more burden than weapon. He could have lifted it, could have fired into the air, could have tried to drive them back, but he knew such a move would be his end. He was one man alone, and they were 10, armed and ready, bound by ties of blood and loyalty he could not break. He glanced at the window where the girl lay just beyond the thin wooden walls, her face pale, her body still weak from fever. He had kept her alive through the night, but he could not tell if her people meant to save her now or finish what had been started on the trail. The leader rode closer, the scarred man Elias had noticed before, his horse tossing its head impatiently. His eyes were cold, steady, as if weighing the worth of the man before him. He barked another order, louder this time, his arm lifting toward the cabin again. Elias took a step forward, his boots grinding against the porch, and shook his head once. He pointed to the girl's bandaged shoulder, then touched his own chest, as if to say he had cared for her, not harmed her. The warriors muttered among themselves, their voices low and sharp, their eyes flicking between Elias and the cabin door. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. Elias could feel it in his bones, the way the circle of men pressed in tighter, the way the land itself seemed to hold its breath. He thought of his wife again, of the helplessness he had once felt at her bedside, and he felt the same ache rising now. He had not saved her, but this girl was still breathing. He would not hand her over to death, not even if it came wearing the faces of her own people. The girl's voice called out once more, weaker this time, yet filled with urgency. The scarred leader froze, his head tilting as he listened. Something in her tone softened the steel in his gaze. He raised his hand, and the warriors stilled, their muttering fading. Elias stood tall, his rifle still lowered, his breath sharp in his chest. The moment hung heavy between them, a line drawn not in words but in silence. He did not know if the next heartbeat would bring peace or blood, but he knew he would not move aside. The leader swung down from his horse, with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. The animal snorted, hooves pawing at the ground, but the warrior's steps were slow and steady as he moved toward the porch. His height and bearing made him seem larger than he was, the scar running down his cheek, catching the first edge of sunlight, and his eyes locked on Elias with a cold fire that made the air feel heavier. The other riders stayed mounted, their circle unbroken, their weapons still within reach. Elias felt the weight of 10 men pressing down on him, but it was the single figure before him that froze his blood. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, the wood worn smooth against his palm, but he knew raising it now would mean his death before he could even pull the trigger. The leader stopped a few paces away, staring at him in silence, his chest rising and falling, like a man holding back words too sharp to waste. Elias felt the pull of that gaze like a rope around his throat, but instead of answering fear with threat, he let the rifle slide low until the barrel touched the porch. Then, with a slow breath, he set it aside and lifted both hands, spreading his fingers wide so they could see. The palms of his hands were raw, the skin cracked and reddened from long hours of labor, but the fresh marks of bandages stood out clear in the morning light. The strips of cloth were still stained with the girl's blood, the edges damp from the water he had used to cool her fever. Elias held them out like proof, his shoulders square, his voice silent but steady. He had no words in their tongue, no speeches to give, only the truth written on his skin. For a long moment, nothing moved. The scarred leader's eyes flicked from Elias's palms to the cabin door, then back again. Behind him, one of the younger warriors muttered something harsh, his tone sharp with anger, and a murmur spread through the circle. But the leader raised a hand, and the noise died at once. He took one step closer. Close enough now that Elias could see the lines of age and battle etched deep into his face. And with just a glance, he made Elias feel as though he was standing trial before a judge older than the hills themselves. Elias's mouth was dry, but he forced himself not to look away. He thought of the girl inside, her frail body shaking with fever, her voice calling weakly through the night, and he thought of his wife, gone too soon because no one had been there to fight for her. That memory gave him strength, and he kept his hands steady even as sweat ran down his neck. The leader studied him a moment longer, then gave a short nod, not of trust but of acknowledgement. He turned his head slightly and barked a command to the others. The circle eased, not broken but loosened, the riders shifting in their saddles as if the storm that had hung heavy over the cabin had passed a fraction. Elias let out a slow breath he had been holding and lowered his hands. He did not know what had been decided, not yet, but he knew he had passed some kind of test. The door creaked behind Elias, and he turned just enough to see her, the girl, pale and trembling, bracing herself against the frame as if the wood itself kept her from falling. The blanket he had wrapped around her shoulders slipped at the edges, showing the bandage he had tied across her wound, already stained through with fresh red. Her eyes, though half lidded from fever, were fierce with something more than pain, and when her gaze found the scarred leader, her lips moved with urgency. She spoke in quick bursts, the language sharp and flowing, her voice too weak to carry, far yet strong enough to still the men around them. The leader froze as soon as he heard her, his hard expression softening like stones struck by rain. His hands, once clenched at his sides, eased open, and he took a single step closer, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. Elias felt the change ripple through the circle like a wind through dry grass, loosening the edge of the threat, but it did not vanish. The girl swayed where she stood, her knees buckling slightly. Elias moved without thinking, steadying her arm with his hand. She did not flinch away this time, but kept her eyes on the leader, speaking again, more slowly, her tone carrying a plea Elias could not understand. The scarred man's jaw tightened, and he answered in their tongue, his words low but heavy, and though Elias could not catch their meaning, he felt the weight of old ties in them. Brother, she had called him brother. The warriors around the circle shifted uneasily in their saddles. Some glanced at each other, their eyes flashing with distrust. One spat into the dirt, muttering something sharp that made another nod in agreement. Their stares cut into Elias like blades, suspicion thick in the air. He could read the meaning clear enough. This white man had touched her, tended her, and they did not know if that made him savior or defiler. The line between the two was thin and dangerous. The leader, however, kept his eyes on the girl. He stepped closer until he stood at the base of the porch, and for the first time since he had arrived, his voice softened. The girl's reply was weaker now, her strength waning, but her hand lifted just enough to gesture toward Elias. The scarred man's gaze followed, falling hard upon him once more. Elias felt it like a weight across his chest, but he did not look away. He let the leader see the truth in his eyes, that he had not meant harm, that his only sin was refusing to watch her die. The girl coughed, her body folding in on itself, and Elias caught her before she fell. The moment burned sharp into the morning, the sight of him holding her, cradling her frail weight in his arms, while the Sioux warriors stared. Some faces hardened, others flickered with doubt, but none moved to strike. The scarred leader lifted his hand again, this time not as a command, but as a sign to wait, and slowly he nodded. It was not trust, not forgiveness, but the first fragile thread of understanding stretched between them. Elias carried the girl back inside, laying her gently on the bed, his ears sharp to the quiet outside where the warriors murmured among themselves. The storm had not passed, only eased, and he knew their eyes would stay fixed on him. Still, as he tucked the blanket around her again and watched her eyelids flutter shut, he felt something shift. For the first time, she was not only his burden but also his shield. The bond between them, frail as it was, had reached the man who mattered most. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling over the ridge and sharpening the edges of every shadow. The warriors still circled the cabin, though their horses had grown restless, snorting and pawing at the earth as if they too felt the strain of waiting. Elias stood near the porch steps, his rifle untouched at his side, his hands loose, though every muscle in him was strung tight. The girl lay inside again, her voice no longer carrying out to soften the air, and without her presence, the tension thickened once more. One of the younger warriors broke the silence. He spat hard into the dust, the sound sharp as a whip crack, then pointed straight at Elias, his words fast and bitter. Though Elias could not understand the language, he needed no translation. The venom in the man's tone was enough, his finger like a blade thrust toward the chest of every white settler who had ever raised a rifle at their people. Elias's throat tightened, his jaw clenched. He stood still as stone, though inside, he felt the old shame crawl back through his blood. He knew what the man was saying without hearing it plain. White men had killed their kin, burned their lodges, taken their land with laws written in books that never saw the truth of prairie soil. He had not done those things himself, but he carried the color and the name of the ones who had, and to the warrior that made him guilty all the same. The circle stirred with murmurs, anger rising like heat off summer ground. The young warrior's voice grew sharper, each word a lash, and another man nodded fiercely in agreement. Elias felt their hate like arrows aimed at his chest. His palms itched for the rifle, but he did not reach for it. He would not when he had already shown his hands once, in proof of what he had done for the girl. Still, standing there beneath the weight of their eyes, he felt the helplessness of being judged for sins he had never chosen. The scarred leader remained silent at first, his gaze steady, but even his stillness could not smother the fury building among the men. Elias looked at them each in turn, their faces hard, their eyes carved from grief and rage, and he thought of all the graves scattered across the plains, white and Sioux alike. The earth swallowing the cost of men who believed the other should not live. The air itself seemed to pulse with memory, old wounds cut open again by sight alone. Elias forced himself to stand tall, though the dust seemed to rise around his boots like a grave waiting to close. He wanted to speak, to tell them he had not lifted his rifle against their people, that his life had been one of solitude and earth, but he knew the words would break useless against their anger. So he stayed silent, his eyes steady, letting them see not defiance but the same truth he had shown before, that he had saved one of their own, and if they wanted his blood for the crimes of others, they would take it from a man who had nothing left but honor. The leader finally spoke, his voice low but strong, and the younger warrior fell silent, though his eyes still burned. The dust settled a little, the air easing though not clearing, and Elias felt the moment hang heavy like a blade above his head. He had not earned their trust, only bought himself another breath. Yet in that breath, in that fragile pause, he felt something stir, a thin hope that maybe not all debts had to be paid in blood. The demand came sharp, carried on the scarred leader's voice, translated through tone and gesture even though Elias could not understand every word. The meaning was plain enough. One of the warriors jabbed his hand toward the cabin, then toward the open plains beyond, his voice hard and cutting. They wanted him gone, stripped of his home, driven out as punishment for daring to shelter their kin. The circle of riders shifted in agreement, horses stamping, weapons clinking, and Elias felt the full weight of their judgment pressing down like a storm ready to break. For a moment he stood silent, the morning wind tugging at his shirt, the cabin at his back like the only anchor he had left. He thought of the years he had spent raising these walls with his own hands, the long days of cutting timber, the nights spent under a roof still half built, the sweat and labor poured into every nail and stone. This place was more than shelter. It was the last piece of himself that the world had not taken. To abandon it now, to crawl away in shame, would be the same as letting them bury him alive. The young warrior who had spat before shouted again, his voice sharp with scorn, his arm sweeping wide to show Elias the direction he should go. The other men muttered in approval, their anger restless and alive. Elias felt his hand brush the rifle, leaning against the post, but he pushed it away. A weapon would not save him here, not against 10 men who had already decided his worth. He straightened slowly, pulling his shoulders back, his face hardening until it was carved from the same stone as the land around him. He stepped down from the porch, the dust rising beneath his boots, and walked forward until there was nothing between him and the leader but a few paces of open ground. The warriors tensed, some gripping their bows tighter, but Elias did not falter. He stopped, lifted his chin, and pulled open his shirt with both hands, baring his chest to the cold morning air. His voice when it came was low but steady, carrying across the circle with steel in its core. "Then take me standing." The words struck the silence like a hammer. The warriors stilled, their anger colliding with the weight of his defiance. Elias held their eyes, one after another, his chest uncovered, his hands empty, daring them to strike him down if that was their will. He would not crawl, would not give up the land he had carved from wilderness, with his own blood and bone. If they wanted him broken, they would have to break him in the open, where the sun could witness it. The scarred leader's gaze lingered on him, sharp and unreadable. The young warrior muttered something under his breath, spitting again into the dirt, but he did not move. The circle had grown quiet, every man waiting, every horse shifting as if caught between fear and fury. Elias stood in the center of it, his chest bare, his breath steady, and for the first time since they had appeared on the ridge he felt no fear, only resolve. The dust hung heavy in the air, every breath drawn like it might be the last. Elias stood bare, chested before the warriors, his eyes steady, the circle around him brimming with tension that could snap into violence with the flick of a hand. The young warrior's bowstring creaked as he drew it half-tight, his gaze burning with hatred, but the scarred leader held still, his stare locked on Elias, as though he were measuring the worth of the man who dared to stand without flinching. Then a sound broke the silence. It was not the cry of a bird or the shuffle of hooves, but a voice, weak yet fierce, spilling from the doorway of the cabin. The girl had risen again, her body trembling, her bandaged shoulder dark with fresh blood, but her spirit blazing like a torch against the gathering storm. She stepped forward, leaning heavily on the frame for support, her eyes fixed not on Elias, but on her brother. She spoke in quick bursts, her words sharp, every syllable edged with a mixture of pain and defiance. The effect was immediate. The warriors shifted, their weapons lowering by a fraction, their hard faces unsettled. Her voice carried the authority of truth, cutting through rage, as if it had been waiting all along for her to speak. Even the young warrior who had spat so often fell silent, his bow lowering slightly as her words filled the air. Elias did not understand what she said, but he understood the weight of it. She was defending him. She was staking her life on his. The scarred leader's expression wavered. He took a step forward, his scar catching the light, his hands clenched at his sides. He answered her in their tongue, his voice heavy, filled with the sound of a man torn between duty and blood. The girl replied, fierce despite her weakness, her hand lifting toward Elias, as though she would drag him into her argument, whether he liked it or not. Elias stood still, letting her words carry the fight. He knew this was not a battle he could win with fists or rifles, only with the truth already spoken in the way he had cared for her. He looked at her, this fragile figure who moments ago had been fighting for her own life, now fighting for his, and he felt something twist deep in his chest. The leader's eyes turned to him again, hard and searching, and for a long heartbeat, Elias thought the decision had already been made, that vengeance would outweigh mercy. But the leader did not lift his weapon. Instead, he stood there, breathing heavy, his gaze shifting between his sister and the man who had kept her alive. The warriors muttered around them, unease rippling through their ranks like wind across the grass. The girl's words ended in a sharp cry, her strength finally breaking as she sagged against the doorframe. Elias stepped forward to catch her, steadying her with careful arms. For a moment, as he held her, the entire circle froze. The leader's stare was heavy as stone, but it did not carry the same fury as before. It carried conflict, as though the weight of old blood demanded one path, while the voice of his sister carved another. Elias met his gaze and did not look away. He could not ask for mercy, could not promise more than what he had already given, but he let the man see his resolve. He would not run, and he would not surrender. The decision was no longer his. It belonged to the bond between brother and sister, and to the truth standing unspoken between enemies who had found themselves bound together by survival. The leader finally raised his hand, and the circle stilled. The young warrior scowled, but he did not resist. Suspicion still burned in every glance, yet violence did not fall. The girl's voice, frail and fierce, had stayed the storm for one more breath. The silence that followed was heavier than the clash of steel. For a long breath the warriors lingered, their horses shifting beneath them, their eyes still sharp with suspicion. The scarred leader sat tall in his saddle, his gaze locked on Elias, and though no words passed between them, the weight of that stare was clear. It was a warning, not shouted but carved into the air, a promise that trust had not been given, only borrowed, and that one misstep would see it broken. Then, with a low-barked command, he turned his horse, the others falling into line behind him, their circle loosening at last. The sound of hooves beat against the earth as they rode back toward the ridge, the dust rising like smoke until the plain swallowed them whole. Elias stood rooted on the porch, his chest bare to the cool wind, the sweat drying on his skin. His hands trembled, though his face stayed hard, and only when the last rider vanished did he let out the breath he had been holding. Beside him the girl leaned weakly against the doorway, her body swaying, her face pale but her eyes steady. She had spoken for him, risked her strength, and it was her voice that had kept the rifles from firing. When she shifted her gaze toward him, there was no fear, no doubt, only a tired acceptance, as though she too understood something had changed. He helped her back inside, guiding her to the bed, laying the blanket across her shoulders once more. She did not protest, only sank into the mattress with a soft sigh, her eyes still fixed on him. For the first time since he had carried her from the trees, Elias did not see a wounded stranger or a danger waiting to be unleashed. He saw the bridge she had become, fragile yet unbroken, binding him to a people he had once only known as shadows on the horizon. The cabin felt different now. The walls were the same, the stove still warm, the lantern still flickering, but there was a pulse in the air that had not been there before. Elias walked across the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and rested his hand on the windowsill. Outside, the trail of dust still hung faint against the morning sky, but the land seemed quieter, more alive, as if it too had decided to grant him one more day. He turned back to the girl. She was watching him, her eyes dark and unreadable, but there was no mistaking the small curve of her lips, the faintest ghost of a smile. It struck him deeper than any word could have, and in that moment, the cabin that had once been nothing but a shell of memories no longer felt empty. It held life again, fragile, but real. Elias lowered himself into the chair beside her, his hands resting on his knees, his voice low and rough when he finally spoke. "You'll stay," he said, though he knew she might not understand. Still, she gave a small nod, closing her eyes as if to seal the promise. The fire crackled, the wind whispered against the walls, and for the first time since his wife's death, Elias felt he was not alone. He did not know what name the future would give them, friends, kin, something else entirely. But as the dust settled outside, and the prairie stretched wide and endless, he knew this much was true. The cabin was alive again, and so was he. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.